What if I told you that the ancestor of Jesus Christ came from a nation God himself cursed? A people born from an unspeakable act in a cave, forbidden from entering God's assembly for 10 generations, yet destined to produce the great-grandmother of the Messiah, the Moabites, a nation that shouldn't exist, worshipping gods that demanded child sacrifice, yet holding a secret key to humanity's salvation. Why did a pagan prophet hired to curse Israel end up blessing them instead on Moabite soil? What made a desperate king sacrifice his own son on a city wall, causing armies to flee in terror? What made a desperate king sacrifice his own son on a city wall, causing armies to flee in terror? How did ancient stone monuments buried for millennia suddenly emerge to confirm prophecies written thousands of years ago? And the most haunting question of all, why did God promise to restore a nation he had condemned to destruction? From forbidden origins to prophetic mysteries, from brutal conquests to impossible redemption, the Moabites walked a razor's edge between divine judgment and inexplicable grace. Their story reveals something shocking, that God's plan of salvation was always bigger, stranger, and more merciful than anyone imagined. Prepare to discover the nation that was cursed to be blessed. The story of Moab begins in the aftermath of one of the Bible's most catastrophic judgments. Fire and sulfur had rained down from heaven, consuming the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah along with all their inhabitants. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, had barely escaped with his 2 daughters. His wife had looked back, despite the angel's warning, and became a pillar of salt. Now the 3 survivors found themselves alone in the mountains, traumatized and isolated from the world they once knew. They settled in a cave, far from any civilization. The daughters looked around at the desolate landscape and made a terrible assumption. As recorded in Genesis 19:31, the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth." They believed they were the last people alive. In their minds, the entire world had been destroyed, and humanity itself was on the brink of extinction. What happened next was born from desperation and a twisted sense of duty. The older daughter devised a plan that would shock any reader. Genesis 19:32 records her saying, "Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That very night they gave Lot wine until he was drunk. The older daughter went in and lay with him, and Lot was so intoxicated that he didn't realize when she lay down or when she got up. So they repeated the terrible act, getting their father drunk again, and the younger daughter also slept with him. Once more, Lot was completely unaware of what was happening. Both daughters became pregnant from these encounters with their father. When the time came for them to give birth, the older daughter had a son. As we read in Genesis 19:37, the older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The name Moab literally means "from father" in Hebrew, a permanent reminder of his shameful origin. The younger daughter also had a son named Ben-Ami, who became the father of the Ammonites. These 2 nations, born from incest in a cave, would become Israel's neighbors and frequent adversaries for over 1,000 years. As Moab's descendants multiplied through the generations, they began to migrate and search for a land to call their own. The region they eventually claimed lay east of the Dead Sea, a territory that would bear their ancestors' name. This wasn't empty wilderness. It was a land of rolling plateaus, fertile valleys, and strategic importance. The territory of Moab stretched along the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, bordered by natural boundaries that made it defensible and prosperous. The Arnon River formed a natural northern boundary, while the Zered River marked the southern edge. This gave the Moabites control over a significant stretch of the King's Highway, one of the ancient world's most important trade routes connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia. The land itself was remarkably suited for the lifestyle the Moabites would develop. The plateau region, offered excellent grazing for sheep and goats, with grass that grew thick during the rainy season. The valleys produced grain, wheat and barley that could feed a growing population. Unlike the harsh wilderness to the south or the rugged mountains to the east, Moab's heartland was a place where people could build cities, raise families, and establish a lasting civilization. Water was available from seasonal streams and wells, though not as abundant as in some regions. The climate was harsh at times, with hot summers and cold winters at the higher elevations, but the Moabites learned to adapt. They built stone houses with thick walls to keep cool in summer and warm in winter. They developed cisterns to store water during the dry months. They learned which crops grew best in their soil and which animals thrived on their pastures. The Moabites weren't wandering nomads. They became settled agriculturalists and herders who built permanent towns. Archaeological evidence shows they constructed fortified cities with defensive walls, administrative buildings, and organized street plans. Their society developed crafts, including pottery, metalworking, and textile production. The wool from their vast flocks became a valuable trade commodity, and their position on the trade routes brought them into contact with merchants and ideas from across the ancient Near East. But the land the Moabites desired wasn't empty when they arrived. Long before Moab's descendants sought to settle there, the territory was inhabited by a fearsome people known as the Emim. These weren't ordinary inhabitants. They were giants, a remnant of the ancient races that once dominated the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 describes these original inhabitants. The Emim used to live there, a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaites, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Rephaites were a legendary race of giants, and the Anakites were the giants that would later terrify the Israelite spies who scouted Canaan. The Emim belonged to this same category of formidable warriors whose very presence struck fear into normal-sized people. The name Emim itself meant terrible ones or frightening ones, a name that captured how others viewed them. Imagine the challenge facing the growing Moabite population. They needed land to expand, but standing in their way were giants who had held this territory for generations. The Emim had the advantage of size, strength, and established fortifications. They knew the land intimately and had defended it against previous invaders. Yet somehow, the Moabites succeeded where others might have failed. The Bible doesn't give us the details of how the war was fought, no descriptions of specific battles or strategies, but we know the outcome. Deuteronomy 2:11 matter-of-factly states that the Moabites drove out the Emim and settled in their place. This was no small military achievement. It required organization, courage, and determination to face opponents who were literally giants. This conquest established something important about the Moabite nation from its early days. They were capable warriors who could fight for what they wanted. They weren't going to be pushed around despite their small beginnings in a cave generations earlier. The defeat of the Emim gave the Moabites confidence, territory, and a military reputation. It also gave them established cities and fortifications they could adapt for their own use, jump-starting their development as a nation. With the land secured and the giants defeated, the Moabites began building something that would last for centuries. A distinct kingdom with its own culture, religion, and identity. Though they shared linguistic and ethnic roots with the Israelites through Abraham's family line, the Moabites developed their own unique civilization. At the heart of Moabite culture was their religion centered on Chemosh, their national god. While the Israelites worshipped the Lord God of Abraham, the Moabites built high places and altars to Chemosh throughout their land. This wasn't just personal religion. Chemosh was seen as the divine protector of the Moabite nation, much as the Israelites saw the Lord as their divine king. When Moab prospered, they credited Chemosh. When they suffered defeat, they believed Chemosh was angry with them. The Moabites established their capital at different locations over time, with Ar and Kir-Hareseth being the most prominent. These weren't simple villages. They were fortified cities with massive stone walls, towers, and gates. Inside the walls, they built administrative buildings, temples, homes, and marketplaces. The architecture showed sophisticated planning and engineering knowledge. They quarried stone, shaped it, and built structures that could withstand both weather and warfare. The Moabite language was closely related to Hebrew, so close that Israelites and Moabites could understand each other with little difficulty. They wrote using a similar alphabet and kept records of their history, religious practices, and royal achievements. This literacy wasn't limited to a small elite class. Evidence suggests that writing and reading were relatively widespread among Moabite officials and priests. Economically, the Moabites thrived on a combination of agriculture and trade. Their sheep produced wool that was exported throughout the region. The grain from their fields fed their population and provided surplus for trade. Their location on the King's Highway meant that caravans regularly passed through their territory, paying taxes and fees that enriched the kingdom. They traded with Egypt to the south, with the Arameans to the north, and with other neighboring kingdoms. Moabite society had a clear hierarchy with a king at the top, followed by nobles and officials, then common farmers and herders, and likely slaves at the bottom. The king wasn't just a political leader, he also had religious duties, serving as the chief representative before Chemosh. Royal inscriptions show that Moabite kings took credit for building projects, military victories, and religious reforms, much like kings in other ancient Near Eastern nations. Centuries after Moab's founding, a crisis arose that would forever link Moab's name with one of the Bible's strangest stories. The Israelites, having escaped slavery in Egypt, were journeying toward the Promised Land. They had defeated the Amorite kings Sihon and Og, conquering territories north of Moab. Now they camped in the plains of Moab, across the Jordan River from Jericho, and their numbers were vast. King Balak, son of Zippor, sat on Moab's throne, and what he saw terrified him. Numbers 22:2-3 tells us, "Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified, because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites." The Moabites remembered how the Israelites had destroyed armies that seemed unbeatable. If Israel decided to attack Moab, what chance did they have? Balak needed a different kind of weapon. He sent messengers with payment to Balaam, son of Beor, a prophet with an international reputation. The messengers traveled to Petha, near the Euphrates River, carrying fees for divination and a desperate message. Numbers 22:5-6 records Balak's words. "A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." Balaam was intrigued by the offer, but something extraordinary happened. That night, God came to Balaam and asked who these visitors were. When Balaam explained Balak's request, God's response in Numbers 22:12 was clear. "Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed." So Balaam sent the Moabite officials away, telling them the Lord had refused to let him go with them. But Balak wasn't ready to give up. He sent more officials, more numerous and distinguished than the first group, with promises of great honor and whatever Balaam wanted. This time God told Balaam he could go, but only if he spoke exactly what God told him to speak. So Balaam saddled his donkey and went with the Moabite officials, leading to the famous incident where his donkey saw the angel of the Lord and refused to move forward. When Balaam finally reached Moab, Balak took him to high places where they could see the Israelite camp spread across the plains. 3 times Balak brought Balaam to different locations, Bamoth Baal, the top of Pisgah, and the top of Peor, hoping that from one of these vantage points Balaam would curse Israel. Each time, Balaam built 7 altars and sacrificed bulls and rams. Each time he went aside to meet with God. And each time, instead of curses, blessings poured from his mouth. Numbers 23:19-20 records one of Balaam's responses to the frustrated king. God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot change it. Balaam saw something about Israel that Balak couldn't understand. They weren't blessed because of their own strength or righteousness, but because the God of Abraham had chosen them, and his purposes couldn't be overturned by ritual or magic. The prophecies Balaam spoke over Israel were powerful and far-reaching. He declared in Numbers 24:17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. This wasn't just about the immediate situation. Balaam was seeing into the distant future, predicting the rise of a king from Israel who would subdue Moab and other nations. Christians later saw this as a prophecy ultimately pointing to Christ. Balak's plan had completely backfired. He paid a fortune to have Israel cursed, but instead received prophecies of Israel's future dominance over Moab. The king was furious. Numbers 24:10-11 describes his reaction. Then Balak's anger burned against Balaam. He struck his hands together and said to him, I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times. Now leave at once and go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded. Balaam returned home, having spoken truth he couldn't control, and Balak was left to face the Israelite threat without supernatural assistance. While Israel was camped in the plains of Moab, something happened that would create a permanent stain on the relationship between these 2 nations. If Balaam couldn't curse Israel through prophecy, another strategy emerged, one that would prove devastatingly effective. The Israelite men began to engage in sexual immorality with Moabite women. Numbers 25:1-2 describes what happened. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial food and bowed down before these gods. This wasn't just casual interaction between neighbors, it was a deliberate seduction that led to spiritual corruption. The Moabite women invited the Israelite men to participate in worship ceremonies dedicated to their gods, particularly Baal of Peor. What started as physical temptation became spiritual adultery. The Israelite men didn't just sleep with foreign women, they participated in pagan worship rituals, ate food sacrificed to idols, and bowed down before gods that weren't the Lord. This violated the very first commandment God had given at Mount Sinai. The Israelites, who had been blessed by Balaam despite Balak's wishes, were now cursing themselves through their own choices. God's response was immediate and fierce. Numbers 25:3-4 tells us, So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. The Lord said to Moses, Take all the leaders of these people, kill them and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. This wasn't a private sin, it required public judgment. Moses commanded the judges to execute everyone who had joined in worshipping Baal of Peor. While this was happening, an Israelite man brazenly brought a Midianite woman into the camp in full view of Moses and the whole assembly as they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. A priest named Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, saw this act of defiance. He grabbed a spear, followed the couple into a tent, and drove the spear through both of them. Numbers 25:8-9 records the result. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. God commended Phinehas for his zealous action, declaring in Numbers 25:11-12, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my wrath away from the Israelites. Since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am, I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him." The plague stopped, but 24,000 Israelites had died because of what happened at Peor. This incident created a deep wound in the relationship between Israel and Moab. What Balak couldn't accomplish through curses, the Moabites achieved through seduction. They had led God's people into idolatry and sexual sin, causing a massive plague and divine judgment. The memory of what happened at Peor would influence Israel's laws and attitudes toward Moab for generations to come. As Moses' life drew to its close, God brought him to a mountain in Moab for one final, bittersweet moment. Moses had led Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, and across 40 years of wilderness wandering. He had received the law on Mount Sinai, interceded for the people countless times, and brought them to the very edge of the promised land. But because he had struck the rock at Meribah, instead of speaking to it as God commanded, Moses would not enter Canaan with his people. Deuteronomy 32:48-50 records God's instructions. On that same day, the Lord told Moses, "Go up into the Abarim range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, and view Canaan, the land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people." Mount Nebo stood in Moabite territory, a high peak from which the entire land of promise could be seen. Moses climbed the mountain, each step bringing him closer to his final moment on earth. When he reached the summit, God showed him something extraordinary. Deuteronomy 34:1-4 describes the panoramic view. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Standing on that Moabite mountain, Moses could see everything his people would inherit: the rolling hills of Judah, the fertile valleys of the north, the plains where battles would be fought and cities would rise. He saw the Jordan River snaking through the landscape, the Dead Sea shimmering in the distance, and the mountains of Canaan rising beyond. Every tribe's inheritance lay before his eyes, the fulfillment of promises made to Abraham 400 years earlier. Then on that mountain, at 120 years old, Moses died. Deuteronomy 34:5-7 tells us, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is." Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. God himself buried Moses in an unmarked grave in Moabite territory. The Israelites mourned for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. The man who had spoken with God face to face, who had performed signs and wonders in Egypt, who had led an entire nation through impossible situations, was gone. His final resting place remained hidden, perhaps to prevent it from becoming a shrine or place of idolatry. Moses' life ended in Moab, in the land of Israel's complicated relatives, a quiet end for one of history's greatest leaders. After everything that had happened between Israel and Moab, the refused hospitality during the wilderness journey, the attempt to curse Israel through Balaam, and especially the seduction at Peor, God established a permanent boundary between the two nations. This wasn't just a temporary policy or a suggestion. It was a divine law that would shape the relationship between Israelites and Moabites for centuries. Deuteronomy 23:3-4 records the clear prohibition: no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam son of Beor from Pethor in Aram-Naharaim to pronounce a curse on you. The standard waiting period for other foreigners to join Israel was 3 generations, but for Moabites and Ammonites, even 10 generations wasn't enough. The reasons God gave were specific. First, the Moabites had shown no compassion or hospitality when Israel passed by their borders. In the ancient Near East, providing food and water to travelers wasn't optional. It was a sacred duty. The Moabites had refused this basic kindness to their own relatives, the descendants of Abraham through Lot. Second, they had hired Balaam to curse Israel, showing active hostility rather than mere indifference. Though Balaam ended up blessing Israel instead, Moab's intention was clear. But the passage continues with a reminder of God's protection and irony. Deuteronomy 23:5-6 adds, "However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live." God had transformed Balak's intended weapon into a blessing, demonstrating his power to override human schemes. Nevertheless, the prohibition stood. Israelites were not to pursue peace treaties or friendly alliances with Moab. This law created a clear social and religious boundary. Moabites could live near Israel, trade with Israel, even visit Israelite towns, but they couldn't fully integrate into Israel's covenant community. They couldn't participate in Israel's religious festivals, couldn't bring offerings to the tabernacle or temple, and couldn't intermarry with Israelites without consequences. The law was designed to protect Israel from the spiritual corruption that had nearly destroyed them at Peor. Yet even this harsh exclusion law contained a subtle acknowledgement. It mentioned the 10th generation, implying that eventually, after an almost impossibly long time, even Moabites might theoretically enter the assembly. The law was severe, but not absolutely eternal. And as Israel's history would later demonstrate, God's grace sometimes worked in ways that transcended legal boundaries, showing that faith and loyalty could sometimes matter more than bloodline. But that story belonged to a later generation. After Israel settled in the Promised Land, they entered a dark cycle that would repeat throughout the period of the Judges. The pattern was always the same. Israel would turn away from God, worship idols, and then face consequences. This time, their disobedience opened the door for Moab to become their oppressor. Judges 3:12-13 describes what happened. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. Eglon wasn't just any king. The Bible specifically mentions that he was a very fat man, a detail that becomes important later in the story. The city of palms was Jericho, the same city whose walls had fallen when Joshua led Israel into Canaan generations earlier. Now it was under foreign control again, this time by Moab. Eglon formed a coalition with Israel's other enemies, the Ammonites and Amalekites, making his force even more powerful. This wasn't a quick raid, it was a full conquest and occupation. For 18 long years, Israel served King Eglon. Judges 3:14 simply states, "The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Think about what that means. For nearly 2 decades, Israelite families had to pay tribute to a foreign king. Their harvests went to fill Moabite storehouses. Their labor enriched another nation. Young Israelites grew up knowing nothing but Moabite dominance, watching their parents bow to Eglon's officials. The humiliation was complete. The descendants of those who had crossed the Jordan River with Joshua, who had conquered city after city with God's help, were now subjects of the very nation God had warned them about. The Moabites remembered how Israel had refused to attack them during the wilderness wandering because of their family connection through Lot. Now Moab showed no such mercy. They exploited Israel ruthlessly, taking full advantage of their position of power. Eglon set himself up in Jericho, right in the heart of Israelite territory. He established a palace there, a constant reminder of Israel's defeat. Every time the Israelites brought their tribute payments, they had to face the reality of their situation. The fat king sat on his throne, growing richer from Israelite labor, while God's people groaned under the weight of their oppression. But God heard Israel's cries. When the people finally turned back to him in desperation, he raised up a deliverer from the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Ehud, son of Gera, and he had a unique characteristic that would prove crucial to God's plan. Judges 3:15 introduces him this way. Again the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. Being left-handed was unusual in those days, rare enough that the Bible specifically mentions it. Most warriors carried their swords on their left side and drew them with their right hand. But Ehud was different. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver their tribute payment to King Eglon. Before he went, Ehud made himself a special weapon. Judges 3:16 describes it. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. A cubit was roughly 18 inches, making this a short sword or long dagger. Because Ehud was left-handed, he strapped it to his right thigh, exactly the opposite of where guards would expect to find a weapon. Ehud traveled to Jericho with other Israelites carrying the tribute. They presented their gifts to Eglon, going through all the proper ceremonies and protocols. Judges 3:17 adds an important detail. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After the official presentation was complete, Ehud sent away the men who had carried the tribute with him, but Ehud himself turned back. He reached the stone images near Gilgal and returned to the palace. When he approached the king, he said something that immediately caught Eglon's attention. Judges 3:19 records his words, "I have a secret message for you, your majesty." Any king would be curious about a secret message, especially from a representative of a subject nation. Perhaps it was intelligence about a rebellion, or an offer to betray his own people, or some other valuable information. Eglon dismissed all his attendants, wanting privacy for whatever Ehud was about to reveal. The king rose from his seat, and at that moment, Ehud struck. Judges 3:21-22 describes the assassination in vivid detail. Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. The description is graphic but important. Eglon's obesity meant the sword went in completely, handle and all, disappearing into his flesh. This wasn't a clean kill, it was brutal and messy. The king, who had grown fat on Israel's labor, died by a hidden blade, wielded by the left hand of a man he had underestimated. Ehud didn't panic. Judges 3:23-24 shows his calm planning. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. The servants assumed their king was using the bathroom, so they waited respectfully outside, giving Ehud precious time to escape. The servants waited so long they became worried. Finally, Judges 3:25 tells us, They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fallen to the floor, dead, Aduri. By the time they discovered Eglon's body, Ehud was long gone, having escaped past the stone images and reached safety in Syra. Ehud didn't waste his head start. As soon as he reached the hill country of Ephraim, he took action. Judges 3:27 describes what happened next. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. The trumpet blast was a call to arms, a signal that the time for liberation had come. The Israelites who gathered around Ehud had lived under Moabite oppression their entire adult lives. Now their leader told them something that must have seemed unbelievable. Judges 3:28 records Ehud's declaration, "Follow me, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." The Lord had given them victory, not might give, but had given. Ehud spoke with the confidence of someone who had already seen God's deliverance in action. Ehud's strategy was brilliant. He led the Israelites to seize control of the fords of the Jordan River. These shallow crossing points were the only practical way for the Moabites east of the Jordan to return home, or for reinforcements to arrive from Moab proper. Judges 3:28 explains, "So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over." Now the Moabite occupiers in Jericho and the surrounding area were trapped. They couldn't retreat across the river to safety. They couldn't send messengers for help. They were cut off in enemy territory, with their king dead and an Israelite army mobilized against them. The hunters had become the hunted. What followed was a complete military victory. Judges 3:29 describes the scope of Israel's triumph. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not one escaped. 10,000 men. This wasn't a small garrison or a raiding party. This was a substantial military force, and Israel killed every single one. The text emphasizes that these were capable warriors, not weak or unprepared soldiers. They were vigorous and strong, the kind of men you'd choose for an occupation force in hostile territory, yet not one escaped. The fords of the Jordan, which should have been their escape route, became the site of their destruction. The river that the Moabites had once crossed to oppress Israel now ran with their blood as Israel reclaimed their freedom. Judges 3:30 summarizes the result. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. The tables had completely turned. Moab, which had oppressed Israel for 18 years, was now subject to Israel. The cycle had reversed, and it would last for 4 times as long as the oppression had. For 80 years, nearly a full human lifetime, there would be peace. Generations passed, and Israel entered another turbulent period, the time of the judges, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. During this era, a famine struck the land of Judah. Famines weren't uncommon in the ancient world, but this one was severe enough to force people to make desperate decisions. In the town of Bethlehem, which ironically means house of bread, a man named Elimelech lived with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion. Ruth 1:1-2 introduces the family. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. The decision to go to Moab must have been difficult. This was the land of Israel's historic enemy, the nation God had excluded from his assembly. But hunger has a way of overriding other concerns. Elimelech looked at his starving family, looked at the empty fields around Bethlehem, and made a choice. They would go to Moab where there was food. The text says they went to live for a while. This was supposed to be temporary, just until the famine ended, just until they could return home. But life rarely goes according to plan. What started as a short stay became something much longer and more complicated. The family settled into life in Moab. The sons grew older, and as young men do, they began to notice the young women around them. Ruth 1:4 tells us what happened. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. This was significant. According to the law Moses had given, Israelites were not supposed to seek friendship or marriage with Moabites. Yet here were two Israelite men taking Moabite wives. Perhaps they justified it because they were living in Moab, not in Israel. Perhaps the law seemed less important when they were far from home. Perhaps they simply fell in love and didn't think about the religious implications. The text doesn't tell us their reasoning, only the fact. Mahlon and Chilion married Orpah and Ruth. Then tragedy struck, not once, but 3 times. Ruth 1:3-5 describes the catastrophe. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. In the span of about 10 years, Naomi lost everything. First her husband died, leaving her dependent on her sons. Then both sons died, leaving her completely alone in a foreign land. She had no husband, no sons, no grandsons, no male relative to provide for her or protect her. In that culture, a widow without sons was in one of the most vulnerable positions imaginable. All Naomi had left were 2 Moabite daughters-in-law who were now widows themselves. The temporary move to Moab had become permanent in the worst possible way. What had started as a practical solution to famine had ended in grief and loss. Now Naomi faced a choice about what to do next. Word reached Moab that the famine in Judah had ended. Ruth 1:6 tells us, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. The Lord had provided. The same Lord who Naomi felt had dealt bitterly with her. Still, Bethlehem was home, and there was food there now. She decided to go back. Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth set out together on the road toward Judah. But as they walked, Naomi began to think about what she was asking these young women to do. She was going home, but for them, leaving Moab meant leaving everything they knew. At some point on the journey, Naomi stopped and spoke to her daughters-in-law. Ruth 1:8-9 records her words, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." She was releasing them from any obligation. They had been good wives and good daughters-in-law. Now they deserved a chance at new lives, new marriages, new happiness. Naomi kissed them goodbye, and both women wept aloud. Ruth 1:10 shows their initial response, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi pressed them. She pointed out the harsh reality. She had no more sons for them to marry, no prospects, no way to provide for them. Even if she married that very night and had sons, would they wait years for those boys to grow up? It was impossible. Ruth 1:13 reveals Naomi's bitterness. Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. She believed God was against her, that her suffering was divine punishment. She didn't want to drag these young women down with her into whatever curse she thought she carried. Finally, one of them agreed. Ruth 1:14 tells us, "At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." Orpah made the sensible choice. She went back to her mother's house, back to her people, back to the possibility of a normal life. No one could blame her for that decision. But Ruth refused to let go. When Naomi urged her to follow Orpah's example and return to her people and her gods, Ruth responded with words that have echoed through history. Ruth 1:16-17 preserves her declaration, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." This was more than loyalty to a mother-in-law. This was a complete commitment to a new identity. Ruth was choosing Naomi's people as her people, becoming an Israelite by choice. She was choosing Naomi's God as her God, leaving behind Chemosh and the gods of Moab to follow the Lord. She was choosing to die and be buried in Israel, making this decision permanent for her entire life and beyond. Ruth even invoked the Lord's name in an oath, asking him to punish her if she broke this commitment. A Moabite woman was calling on the God of Israel to hold her accountable. She was crossing every boundary, ethnic, national, and religious, to stay with Naomi. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined, she stopped arguing. Ruth 1:18 simply states, "When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her." So the two women continued the journey together, a bitter Israelite widow and a loyal Moabite daughter-in-law, walking toward an uncertain future in Bethlehem. When the two widows arrived in Bethlehem, it caused quite a stir. Ruth 1:19 describes the reaction. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" The woman who left with a husband and two sons had returned with only a foreign daughter-in-law. They arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest, and Ruth quickly took initiative to provide for them both. According to Israelite law, the poor and foreigners were allowed to glean in the fields, picking up grain that the harvesters left behind. Ruth 2:2 shows her practical approach. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." By what seemed like chance, Ruth ended up gleaning in a field belonging to a man named Boaz. Ruth 2:3 notes, "As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." But this wasn't random chance. This was God's providence at work. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, which would prove significant. When Boaz came from Bethlehem to check on his harvest, he noticed Ruth immediately and asked about her. His foreman explained that she was the Moabite woman who had returned with Naomi. Boaz approached Ruth and spoke kindly to her, telling her to stay in his fields and drink from the water jars his workers had filled. Ruth was overwhelmed by his kindness. Ruth 2:10 captures her response. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" She knew her status. She was a Moabite, a foreigner, someone from a nation Israel was supposed to avoid. But Boaz had heard her story. Ruth 2:11-12 reveals his knowledge and blessing. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz saw Ruth not as a Moabite outsider, but as someone who had chosen to take refuge under the wings of Israel's God. Her loyalty to Naomi and her faith in the Lord mattered more to him than her ethnic background. Throughout the harvest season, he showed her favor, ensuring she had plenty to gather and protecting her from harassment by his workers. As time passed, Naomi recognized an opportunity. Boaz was not just kind, He was a kinsman redeemer, a close relative who had the right and responsibility to help family members in need. Following Naomi's instructions, Ruth approached Boaz at the threshing floor and proposed that he fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer by marrying her. There was a complication. Ruth 3:12 records Boaz's response. "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I." According to the customs of the time, the closest relative had the first right to redeem. Boaz had to give this other man the opportunity to fulfill the duty. Boaz handled the situation with integrity. He went to the town gate where legal matters were settled and presented the case to the nearer kinsman in front of the elders. When the other man learned that redeeming the property meant also marrying Ruth the Moabite, he backed out. Ruth 4:6 records his words, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." So Boaz became Ruth's redeemer. Ruth 4:13 describes the result. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." The Lord, who had seemed absent during all of Naomi's losses, was now actively blessing Ruth's faithfulness. The women of the town celebrated with Naomi. Ruth 4:14-15 preserves their words. "The women said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth.'" They named the baby Obed. But this child was more than just a grandson for Naomi or a son for Ruth and Boaz. Ruth 4:17 reveals his destiny, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This Moabite woman, from a nation excluded from God's assembly, became the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. Her name would be recorded in the genealogy of King David, and ultimately in the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Years later, when Ruth's great-grandson David was running for his life from King Saul, he remembered his Moabite connection. David had become a mighty warrior and a beloved leader, but Saul's jealousy had turned deadly. David was forced to live as a fugitive, moving from place to place, never safe in his own country. During this difficult time, David thought about his parents. They were elderly and vulnerable, easy targets for Saul's anger. David couldn't protect them while he was constantly on the move, and leaving them in Israel meant they could be used as leverage against him. He needed to find them a safe refuge. 1 Samuel 22:3-4 describes David's solution. From there, David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?" So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. David's choice of Moab wasn't random. He had family history there through Ruth. Though it was 3 generations removed, the connection apparently still meant something. The king of Moab knew who David was, knew about his Moabite great-grandmother, and agreed to provide sanctuary. This shows something important about ancient family relationships. Even though Ruth had left Moab decades earlier, even though she had chosen Israel's God and Israel's people, the family tie still existed. The Moabite king honored that connection, protecting David's parents from the murderous rage of Israel's own king. David entrusted his parents to Moabite protection while he remained in the stronghold, waiting to see what God would do for him. The irony is striking. The future king of Israel had to rely on Moab for his family's safety because Israel's current king wanted him dead. Sometimes God's providence works in unexpected ways, using even forbidden connections to accomplish his purposes. The text doesn't tell us how long David's parents stayed in Moab or what eventually happened to them. What matters is that when David needed help, his Moabite ancestry provided a door of escape. The connection that began with Ruth's loyalty to Naomi now came full circle, offering protection to her great-grandson in his time of need. But family connections only go so far in the world of ancient politics. When David finally became king over all Israel and established his kingdom, his relationship with Moab changed dramatically. The grateful fugitive who had sought Moabite protection for his parents became a conquering king who showed Moab no mercy. 2 Samuel 8:2 describes David's conquest with shocking brevity. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. This was brutal even by ancient standards. David didn't just defeat the Moabite army in battle, he executed prisoners of war in a systematic, calculated manner. The captured Moabites were forced to lie down on the ground, and David's men literally measured them with a rope. 2/3 were killed, only 1/3 spared to become subjects who would pay tribute to Israel. The text gives no explanation for this harsh treatment. We don't know if Moab had attacked Israel first, or if they had betrayed David in some way, or if this was simply political calculation. Perhaps Moab had done something to David's parents after he entrusted them to Moabite care. Perhaps they had sided with David's enemies during the civil war with Saul's house. Perhaps David simply decided that Moab needed to be crushed to secure his kingdom's borders. Whatever the reason, the judgment was severe. The nation that had produced Ruth, that had sheltered David's parents, that had family ties to Israel's king, was now subject to Israel with 2/3 of its fighting men dead. The surviving Moabites became tribute-paying vassals, their independence crushed under David's military might. This conquest established Moab's subordinate status to Israel for the rest of David's reign and into Solomon's time. The nation that had once oppressed Israel under Eglon, that had been subdued after Ehud's victory, that had intermarried with Israelite refugees during the Judges period, was now firmly under Israelite control. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Moab would remember David's conquest for generations to come. After King David and his son Solomon died, Israel split into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. During this divided period, Moab remained under Israelite control, forced to pay heavy tribute to the northern kingdom. 2 Kings 3:4 describes the arrangement. Now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. Every year, this staggering amount flowed from Moab to Israel. Mesha was a sheep breeder on a massive scale, but much of his profit went straight into Israel's treasury. Then King Ahab of Israel died. Mesha saw an opportunity. 2 Kings 3:5 records his decision. But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Mesha stopped paying tribute and declared Moab's independence. Ahab's son Joram wasn't about to let this rebellion succeed. He mobilized Israel's army and sent a message to King Jehoshaphat of Judah. 2 Kings 3:7 preserves his words. "Will you go with me to fight against Moab?" Jehoshaphat agreed, responding, "I will go with you. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." Joram also brought in the king of Edom, creating a 3-nation alliance. The allied armies set out on their roundabout route, but after 7 days of marching through the desert, they faced a crisis. 2 Kings 3:9 describes, "So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them." Someone mentioned that Elisha, son of Shaphat, was nearby. The 3 kings went to him. Despite his irritation with Joram, Elisha agreed to seek the Lord's word. He called for a harpist, and as the music played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. 2 Kings 3:16-19 contains his prophecy. This is what the Lord says, I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says, you will see neither wind nor rain. Yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also deliver Moab into your hands. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones. The next morning, exactly as Elisha predicted, water flowed from the direction of Edom and filled the valley. When the Moabites looked across at the Israelite camp, something strange caught their attention. 2 Kings 3:22-23 describes what they saw. When they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water. To the Moabites across the way, the water looked red, like blood. That's blood, they said. Those kings must have fought and slaughtered each other. Now to the plunder, Moab. The Moabites rushed toward the camp, expecting easy plunder. Instead, they ran into a prepared army. 2 Kings 3:24 records, But when the Moabites came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and fought them until they fled. And the Israelites invaded the land and slaughtered the Moabites. The allied armies pushed deep into Moab, destroying everything in their path, just as Elisha had prophesied. King Mesha watched from inside Kir Hareseth as his kingdom fell apart around him. His rebellion had brought disaster. His armies were scattered, his cities destroyed, his fields ruined. Now he was trapped in his capital with enemy forces surrounding the walls and no hope of relief. Mesha tried one last desperate military action. 2 Kings 3:26 describes his attempt. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Even with 700 of his best warriors, Mesha couldn't break the siege. Every direction was blocked, every escape route was cut off. Trapped and facing total defeat, Mesha did something that shocked even the hardened warriors besieging his city. He turned to his religion, to the god Chemosh, and made the ultimate sacrifice. 2 Kings 3:27 records the horrifying act. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. This wasn't just any child. This was the crown prince, the heir to Moab's throne, the next king. Mesha took this precious boy and sacrificed him in full view of everyone, his own people inside the city and the enemy armies outside. The sacrifice was made on the city wall itself, the most public place possible. The Moabites inside watched their future king die at his father's hands. The Israelite, Judahite, and Edomite soldiers outside the walls witnessed a father kill his own son. What happened next is recorded in the same verse. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. Something changed after the sacrifice. The allied armies left. They had been on the verge of total victory. Kir Hareseth was surrounded. The rest of Moab was already devastated. One more push would have ended the kingdom entirely. But they pulled back. They withdrew from Moab and went home. Mesha's terrible sacrifice somehow achieved what his 700 swordsmen could not. It ended the siege and saved what remained of his kingdom. King Mesha didn't just fight his rebellion. He commemorated it in stone for future generations. He commissioned a monument to record his version of events, his victories, his religious devotion to Chemosh, and his building projects. This stone inscription would survive for nearly 3,000 years. The monument, now known as the Mesha Stele, or the Moabite stone, was a black basalt slab about 3 feet tall. Mesha had it inscribed with 34 lines of text in the Moabite language, which was nearly identical to Hebrew. The inscription was carved around 840 BC, shortly after the events described in 2 Kings. The stele was discovered in 1868 by a missionary named Frederick Klein at the site of ancient Dibon in Jordan. When local Bedouin realized the stone might be valuable, they heated it and poured cold water on it, shattering it into pieces. Fortunately, a paper impression had been made before it was destroyed. The fragments were eventually recovered and reassembled, and the monument now sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris. What makes the Mesha stele so important is that it tells the same story as the Bible, but from Moab's perspective. It mentions Omri, king of Israel, Ahab's father, and describes how Omri oppressed Moab. The inscription reads, "Omri was king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land." From Mesha's viewpoint, the years of paying tribute to Israel happened because Chemosh, Moab's god, was angry with Moab. But then Chemosh relented and allowed Mesha to throw off Israel's control. The inscription describes Mesha's military campaigns, his recapture of Moabite towns, and his building projects. He mentions capturing Israelite towns, killing their inhabitants, and dedicating spoils to Chemosh. He describes rebuilding walls, constructing cisterns, and fortifying cities. The stele mentions the same place names found in the Bible, cities like Nebo, Ataroth, and Dibon. It describes Mesha's religious activities, including building high places for Chemosh. The level of detail matches biblical accounts, confirming that both sources describe real historical events. The Bible remembers that Israel devastated Moab, but then withdrew. Mesha's inscription emphasizes his victories. Both sources are historically valuable, showing how the same events looked from different perspectives. Years after Mesha's rebellion, tensions between Israel and Moab continued in a different form. The relationship had settled into a pattern of occasional raids rather than full-scale wars. Moabite bands would cross into Israelite territory, usually in the spring when crops were ready to harvest, attacking vulnerable settlements and taking whatever they could carry. 2 Kings 13:20 describes this ongoing threat. Elisha died and was buried. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. These weren't organized military campaigns. They were hit-and-run attacks by groups of warriors looking for plunder. They would strike quickly, grab livestock or goods, and disappear back across the border before Israel's army could respond. The timing was strategic. Spring was when farmers were harvesting barley and wheat, when flocks had new lambs, when there was actually something worth stealing. The Moabites knew Israelite farmers would be spread out in their fields, vulnerable and unable to defend themselves effectively. Then something extraordinary happened that showed God's power extended even beyond death. One day, some Israelites were burying a man when they suddenly spotted a band of Moabite raiders approaching. In that culture, proper burial was extremely important, but these men had no time to complete the ceremony. They needed to hide or run, and they couldn't carry the body with them. 2 Kings 13:21 describes their desperate decision and its shocking result. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. The dead man came back to life, not through a prayer or a ritual, but simply by touching the bones of the prophet Elisha, who had died and been buried some time earlier. The corpse they had hastily thrown into the tomb stood up alive, on his own feet, fully restored. This miracle confirmed Elisha's status as a true prophet of God. His ministry of miracles continued even after his death. It demonstrated that God's power wasn't limited by death or physical decay. And it happened specifically in a context involving Moabite raiders, showing that even Moab's aggressive actions couldn't thwart God's purposes. The irony is striking. The Moabites came looking to harm Israelites and steal from them. Instead, their raid became the circumstance through which God displayed his power and brought a dead man back to life. As the years passed and kingdoms rose and fell, God began speaking through his prophets about Moab's future. The prophet Isaiah, who ministered during the 8th century BC, received a burden, a heavy prophetic message, concerning Moab. What he saw wasn't a message of hope, but a vision of coming devastation. Isaiah's prophecy about Moab spans 2 chapters, Isaiah 15 and 16, filled with images of destruction and mourning. Isaiah 15:1 opens with the declaration, a prophecy against Moab. Ar in Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Kir in Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. The 2 main cities of Moab would fall suddenly, destroyed in a single night. The prophecy continues with descriptions of widespread mourning. Isaiah 15:2-3 paints a vivid picture. Dibon goes up to its temple, to its high places to weep. Moab wails over Nebo and Medeba. Every head is shaved and every beard cut off. In the streets they wear sackcloth. On the roofs and in the public squares they all wail, prostrate with weeping. These were the traditional signs of intense grief: shaving heads, cutting beards, wearing sackcloth, weeping publicly. The Moabites would go up to their high places, the worship sites they had built for Chemosh, but their God would offer no help. Even the land itself would suffer. Isaiah 15:6 describes ecological disaster. The waters of Nimrim are dried up, and the grass is withered, the vegetation is gone, and nothing green is left. The streams would dry up, the fields would wither, everything green would die. Isaiah explains why this destruction is coming. Isaiah 16:6 identifies the root cause. We have heard of Moab's pride, how great is her arrogance, of her conceit, her pride and her insolence, but her boasts are empty. Moab's pride, arrogance and empty boasting had brought God's judgment upon them. Then Isaiah gives a specific timeline. Isaiah 16:13-14 concludes, "This is the word the Lord has already spoken concerning Moab. But now, the Lord says, within 3 years, as a servant bound by contract would count them, Moab's splendor and all her many people will be despised, and her survivors will be very few and feeble." Within 3 years, counted as precisely as a hired worker counts down to the end of his contract, everything Isaiah described would come true. About a century after Isaiah, another prophet received an even longer message about Moab's judgment. Jeremiah, who witnessed the fall of Jerusalem and Judah to Babylon, also prophesied extensively about Moab. His oracle takes up Jeremiah 48, containing 47 verses of judgment. Jeremiah's prophecy begins with the same theme, sudden destruction of Moab's cities. Jeremiah 48:1 declares, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, Woe to Nebo, for it will be ruined. Kiriathaim will be disgraced and captured. The stronghold will be disgraced and shattered." Then Jeremiah identifies a key reason for Moab's complacency. Jeremiah 48:11 uses a powerful image. Moab has been at rest from youth like wine left on its dregs, not poured from one jar to another. She has not gone into exile. So she tastes as she did, and her aroma is unchanged. Moab was like wine that had never been poured, sitting on its dregs, unchanged, unrefined. Jeremiah 48:7 addresses Moab's trust. "Since you trust in your deeds and riches, you too will be taken captive, and Chemosh will go into exile together with his priests and officials." Moab trusted in their accomplishments and wealth, but these would not save them. Even Chemosh would go into exile, powerless to protect his people. Jeremiah condemns Moab's attitude toward Israel. Jeremiah 48:26-27 reveals, "Make her drunk, for she has defied the Lord. Let Moab wallow in her vomit. Let her be an object of ridicule. Was not Israel the object of your ridicule? Was she caught among thieves, that you shake your head in scorn whenever you speak of her?" Moab had mocked Israel when Israel faced troubles. Now, Moab would experience the same humiliation. Jeremiah repeatedly emphasizes Moab's pride. Jeremiah 48:29 declares, "We have heard of Moab's pride, how great is her arrogance, of her insolence, her pride, her conceit, and the haughtiness of her heart." Pride wasn't just one problem. It was the defining characteristic that brought Moab down. Despite the harshness of the judgment, Jeremiah expresses genuine sorrow for Moab. Jeremiah 48:31 shows the prophet's compassion. "Therefore I wail over Moab, for all Moab I cry out, I moan for the people of Kir Hareseth." And so, the prophecy concludes with absolute statements of destruction. Jeremiah 48:42 declares, "Moab will be destroyed as a nation because she defied the Lord." Not just defeated or weakened, but destroyed as a nation. The prophecies of both Isaiah and Jeremiah were not empty threats. They came true when the Babylonian Empire swept through the region. Under King Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon conquered nation after nation, and Moab could not escape the onslaught. After defeating Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar established Babylonian dominance over the entire Levant. The small kingdoms that had existed for centuries, including Judah, Ammon, Edom, and Moab, now faced a superpower that would not tolerate independence. When Judah rebelled against Babylon in 589 BC, the Moabites apparently rejoiced at their neighbors' destruction. But their celebration was short-lived. After crushing Jerusalem in 586 BC, destroying the temple, and carrying Judah into exile, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to Moab and the other surrounding nations. The fortified cities that Moab had built over centuries were besieged and conquered. The walls that had protected them were broken down. The population was either killed in battle, carried off into exile to distant parts of the Babylonian Empire, or fled to other regions seeking refuge. The political independence that Moab had maintained for nearly 1,000 years, since the days when they drove out the Emim giants, came to an end. The kingdom founded by Lot's son in a cave, that had fought against Israel for generations, that had worshipped Chemosh on high places throughout their land, ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Unlike Israel and Judah, Moab had no prophets recording their perspective on these events. What we have are the fulfilled prophecies of the Hebrew prophets who had warned this would happen. The Babylonian conquest achieved what no previous enemy had fully accomplished. It destroyed Moab as a nation. The Moabite people were scattered, their cities lay in ruins, and their national identity began to dissolve. Yet in the midst of all the prophecies of judgment and destruction, God spoke one final word about Moab that was completely unexpected. After 47 verses describing Moab's pride, their coming destruction, and their complete downfall, Jeremiah's prophecy ends with a startling promise. Jeremiah 48:47 concludes the oracle with these words, "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in days to come, declares the Lord." Here ends the judgment on Moab. After everything, after the complete destruction, after the nations ceased to exist, after all the warnings about pride and idolatry, God promised restoration. This promise is remarkable because it comes at the very end of unrelenting judgment, like a ray of light breaking through dark clouds. God extended this mercy to a nation that had consistently opposed Israel, that had led Israel into idolatry at Peor, that had mocked Israel when they suffered, and that had been excluded from God's assembly. Moab wasn't part of God's covenant people. They worshipped Chemosh, not the Lord. Yet God promised to restore their fortunes. The promise is brief, just one verse compared to 47 verses of judgment, but its presence shows that God's purposes extend beyond immediate judgment, that his final word is not always destruction, The text doesn't explain how or when the restoration would happen. It simply declares that it will happen. In days to come, the Lord will restore Moab's fortunes. The judgment would certainly occur, and history confirms that it did. Moab fell. Their cities were destroyed. Their nation ceased to exist. Their people were scattered, but that destruction wouldn't be God's final word. The story of the Moabites ends not with their fall to Babylon or their exile, but with this divine promise of restoration in the latter days. If this journey through the history of Moab's children has opened your eyes to the depth and complexity of biblical history, please subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you more untold stories from Scripture that reveal God's intricate plan throughout human history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you found this story as fascinating as we did, share this video with your friends, your family, your Bible study group, anyone who loves diving deep into the rich narratives of Scripture. Let's spread these ancient truths together. What aspect of the Moabite story surprised you most? Was it Ruth's loyalty that transcended ethnic boundaries, Mesha's shocking sacrifice, or God's promise of restoration to a nation that seemed beyond redemption? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Until next time, keep exploring the depths of God's Word. There's always more to discover.